The warehouse floor was freezing at 3 in the morning, and Daniel Cole had exactly 4 hours left before his daughter woke up expecting breakfast. He was running on coffee and stubbornness when the conveyor system locked up, and every second it stayed broken cost the company money he did not have time to think about. He grabbed a wrench, dropped to his knees under the belt, and did something none of the safety manuals told him to do. He rerouted the tension arm using a spare bolt from his own toolbox. The belt groaned, shuddered, and moved again. 4 hours of downtime avoided. Nobody clapped. Nobody even noticed, except a camera mounted above the loading bay that fed directly into a server owned by a man Daniel had never met. That man was Julian Ashford, and he was not supposed to be reviewing warehouse footage that night. He was supposed to be reviewing a board memo about a lawsuit threatening to expose unsafe working conditions across 12 of his distribution centers. But a junior analyst had pulled the wrong file, and Julian, tired and irritated, watched 30 seconds of a stranger fixing what 3 of his own engineers had failed to fix in 2 years. He watched it 4 more times. By morning, Julian Ashford knew 3 things about Daniel Cole. He was 34 years old. He was a single father raising a 7-year-old daughter named Grace. And he was, according to payroll records, paid $9 above minimum wage to solve problems that saved the company millions. Julian did not send an email. He did not schedule a meeting. He walked onto the warehouse floor himself, in a suit that cost more than Daniel's car, and asked to speak with him directly. Daniel assumed he was being fired. He was almost right. Julian did not fire him. He made him an offer instead, one that sounded less like an opportunity and more like a trap dressed up in an expensive tie. "Quit right now," Julian said. "Walk away from this job today, and I will personally fund whatever you decide to build next. Refuse and nothing changes. You go back to your shift like this conversation never happened." Daniel laughed, because it was easier than being afraid. He had heard about men like this before, rich men who liked to play games with poor men's lives because it made an interesting story to tell at dinner parties. He almost said no. He almost turned around and finished his shift like nothing happened. Then he thought about Grace, asleep in an apartment where the heater worked only half the time, and about a folder of medical bills sitting in his kitchen drawer that he had stopped opening because opening them only made the numbers heavier. He did not know yet that this handshake would test everything he believed about honesty, fatherhood, and what a man is willing to lose before he finds out what he is actually made of. The first 2 weeks felt like floating. Daniel woke up without an alarm for the first time in years. He picked Grace up from school early, something he had never been able to do, and watched her face light up in a way that made the risk feel worth it already. He allowed himself, just barely, to believe that maybe good things happen to people like him sometimes. Then the money did not come. Julian's promised funding was tangled inside legal paperwork that Daniel had signed without a lawyer, paperwork full of clauses about intellectual property rights and equity stakes, and timelines measured in months, not days. The severance from his old job barely covered 2 weeks of groceries. The rent notice arrived on a Tuesday, printed on red paper, the kind that does not care how hard you worked the week before. Daniel sold his late wife's watch to a pawn shop that gave him half of what it was worth and all of the shame that came with it. He drove Grace to school in a car that needed 2 tries to start most mornings, and he told her it was fine, it was just old, the same way he told himself everything was fine right up until the moment he stopped believing it. At night, after Grace was asleep, Daniel pulled out the napkin sketch again. It was a modular repair kit, small enough to fit in a toolbox, designed to fix conveyor and pulley systems without needing a full replacement part shipped from 3 states away. He had imagined it fixing exactly the kind of problem he solved that night on the warehouse floor. He had imagined it 100 times without ever believing anyone would pay him to build it. Julian never called, not once. No update, no check-in, nothing. Daniel began to wonder if this was ever a real offer at all. The answer came from a place he did not expect. Grace, homesick from school one afternoon, found a folder Daniel had left open on the kitchen table. Inside it was a printed memo, one he had received by mistake from a lawyer's assistant, who forwarded the wrong file to the wrong email address. Exactly the same kind of accident that had started all of this in the first place. The memo was dated 3 weeks before Julian ever walked onto that warehouse floor. It mentioned Daniel Cole by name. It mentioned his daughter, his late wife, his years of service. It listed his conveyor fix as, quote, a strong human interest angle to counter negative press regarding warehouse safety violations. It was not a discovery, it was a selection. Daniel had not been noticed for his talent. He had been chosen for his story, cross-referenced and approved by a public relations team long before Julian Ashford ever pretended to be moved by a piece of security footage. Daniel read it twice. He did not shout. He did not throw anything. He sat very still at the kitchen table while Grace watched him from the hallway, holding the sketch of the machine he had drawn 100 times, not understanding what a memo was or why her father's hands had gone so quiet. She only understood one thing. Her father had drawn something nobody else had ever drawn. She asked him a question that had nothing to do with public relations strategies or legal loopholes or billionaires who used real families as talking points. She asked if he was going to finish building it or not. Daniel did not answer right away. He looked at the sketch, then at his daughter, then back at the sketch, and for the first time in weeks, he picked the pencil back up. He built the repair kit not because Julian Ashford asked him to, and not because a memo had turned his life into a public relations opportunity. He built it because it was his, because Grace had asked the only question that actually mattered, and because some part of him refused to let a stranger's lie be the reason he stopped believing in his own hands. He applied for a small business loan on his own, no billionaire signature required, using nothing but his old pay stubs and a business plan he wrote at the kitchen table after Grace went to bed. It was not approved right away. It took 3 tries, 3 meetings with loan officers who looked at him the way people look at men wearing second-hand jackets. 3 explanations of exactly how his invention worked before someone finally said yes. He rented a garage that smelled like motor oil and old rubber, the kind of place where the lights flickered if you turned on more than one machine at a time. Grace came with him most evenings, doing her homework on an overturned plastic crate, while Daniel welded, measured, and rebuilt the same 3 prototypes over and over until one of them finally worked exactly the way it had in his head for years. Word about the invention started moving quietly through the same industry that had once paid Daniel $9 above minimum wage to fix machines that were never supposed to be his responsibility. A regional distribution manager, someone who had heard rumors about a repair kit that outperformed systems costing tens of thousands of dollars, reached out and asked for a demonstration. Daniel said yes, not knowing that the man who would eventually see that demonstration was the same man who started all of this. Julian Ashford had not forgotten about Daniel. He had simply expected the story to unfold the way his public relations team designed it, a redemption arc with a scheduled press release and a photograph of a grateful father shaking his hand for the cameras. When that story never appeared, when Daniel stopped answering calls from the legal team and disappeared into silence instead of gratitude, it unsettled Julian more than any lawsuit ever had. So he went looking, quietly, without cameras this time, the same way he had first walked onto that warehouse floor. He found Daniel in a rented garage with flickering lights, watching his invention outperform an industrial system that had cost his own company $40,000, using parts that together cost less than $200. Julian stood in the doorway for a long time before Daniel noticed him. Neither man spoke at first. Julian finally asked the only question he had, without any of the polish his public relations team would have wanted. He asked why Daniel never told him this was what he actually wanted to build. Daniel's answer was short, and it landed harder than anything a lawyer could have written for him. He said Julian never asked, not really. The wager on the warehouse floor was never a real chance at anything. It was a headline wearing a handshake, dressed up to look like generosity when it was actually strategy. Julian did not argue. For a man used to controlling every version of every story that involved his name, the silence that followed was unfamiliar territory. He looked at the prototype again, then at Daniel, Then at Grace sitting quietly on her crate with a homework sheet balanced on her knee, and something in him shifted in a way no boardroom presentation had ever managed to do. He offered Daniel a real deal this time, not a wager, not a press release, a licensing agreement, negotiated on paper, with lawyers Daniel chose and paid for himself. Bristow Logistics would adopt the repair kit across its warehouses, and Daniel would be paid fairly for every unit sold, with full ownership of the design remaining his. Daniel read every line of that contract 3 times before he signed it. Injury rates across the warehouses dropped within months of the kit's rollout. Machines that once required full part replacements were fixed in under an hour using tools that fit inside a single toolbox. Workers who once waited through unpaid downtime kept their full shifts and their full paychecks. It was, by every measure that mattered to a company like Bristow Logistics, a success worth announcing to the public. Julian's team wanted to attach Daniel's photograph to the press release, the same family angle the original memo had planned from the very beginning. Daniel refused. He told them the story could run with the injury numbers, the efficiency data, and nothing else. No family photo, no single dad narrative, no headline turning his daughter into a talking point for a company that once needed a redemption story more than it needed to fix anything real. Julian agreed, and for the first time since this entire story began, he kept his word without needing a camera in the room to remind him to. Grace visited the warehouse on a school career day months later, walking the same floor her father once worked before any of this happened. She found one of the early prototypes on display, dented slightly on one corner from a mistake Daniel had made building it for the first time. She did not know the whole story behind the memo, the wager, or the months her father spent rebuilding trust in his own hands after someone tried to turn his life into a headline. She only knew one thing: her father had built something that worked. Julian watched from an observation deck above the warehouse floor that day, alone, unannounced, the same way he had arrived the very first time he ever saw Daniel Cole fix something broken in the middle of the night. Except this time, there were no cameras rolling, no memo waiting to be written, no story being manufactured for anyone's benefit but the truth itself. Daniel never became the story Bristow Logistics originally wanted him to be. He became something the company never expected to need, a man who built his way out of a trap disguised as an opportunity, and who did it without losing the one thing that mattered more than any contract ever could: the trust of a 7-year-old girl who simply wanted to know if her father was going to finish what he started. He did. And in the end, that was the only ending that ever mattered.